She was spreading white powder on dead ground before the sun came up, and the neighbor watching from the fence line did not say a word. He just looked at the cracked gray soil, looked at the bag on her truck bed, and walked back inside. She did not explain herself. There was nothing yet to explain. What happened on that 12-acre strip in the next 18 months would not make the paper, would not get her a grant, would not earn her so much as a certificate on a wall. But it would put a number on a contract that made a third-generation farming family in Sacramento Valley question everything they thought they knew about damaged land. If you are watching from somewhere with soil under your feet, or somewhere you wish you did, hit subscribe and leave your location in the comments. This story traveled a long way to get here, and the people in it would not have expected anyone to care. Yolo County sits in the broad flat middle of the Sacramento Valley, the kind of place that does not advertise itself. The valley floor here is among the most productive agricultural ground in the country, a deep silty loam built up over 10,000 years of river sediment, warm enough for processing tomatoes in summer and cool enough for winter wheat, close enough to the delta that water was never far. Generations of Italian and Chinese and Japanese families worked the ground here through the 20th century, sharecropping, then owning, then selling, and sometimes losing. The towns are small, and the distances between them are large, and the fields go on in every direction until they disappear into a white haze that could be fog or heat, depending on the month. Some of the best acreage in the valley sits on low-lying ground that sits just above the old floodplain level, and those fields have a complicated history with water. Irrigated agriculture here goes back to the late 19th century, and a century and a half of irrigation on clay-heavy soils in an arid climate has left a complicated legacy. Sodium accumulation is not a rare or exotic problem in the Sacramento Valley. It is a known hazard, a thing that happens quietly when drainage is poor, when irrigation water carries dissolved mineral salts, when a tenant farmer with a short-term calculation and a long-term departure date manages runoff without thinking about what comes next. Marta Del Vecchio had not planned to come back to any of it. She was 39 years old, working a leasing office job in Sacramento, when her father died and left her the farmhouse and a lease agreement she did not fully understand. The land itself was rented to a man named Grover Hinch, who had been farming it for 11 years under her father, and who sent rent checks every quarter without complaint. Her younger brother Sal, who had also inherited a share, told her to leave it alone. The checks were coming. The house was sound. There was no reason to make anything more complicated. Sal was not a bad person. He was just someone who had already made his life somewhere else and did not want to be asked to unmake it. Marta did not plan to make anything complicated. But the lease came up for renegotiation 8 months after the funeral. And when Marta drove out to meet Hinch in person for the first time, he told her he would not be renewing. He was consolidating his operations south, he said. He had found more suitable ground. He shook her hand, and that was the end of it. He said it pleasantly. He said it with the ease of someone who is already finished with a place and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. 2 weeks later, she found out what he had left her with. The 12 acres on the west side of the parcel, the flattest and most sheltered section, the stretch her father had called the good ground, had been used in Hinch's final 2 growing seasons as a dump field for concentrated irrigation runoff. He had tiled the drainage from 300 acres of adjacent vegetable ground and directed the outflow through that 12-acre section, concentrating sodium salts in the topsoil at levels that had killed the standing crop, crusted the surface, and left the clay structure collapsed and impermeable. A county soil conservation staffer named Dara Fish came out at Marta's request, pushed a probe into the ground, and read off numbers that meant nothing to Marta until Fish translated them. The sodium absorption ratio in the top 8 inches was catastrophic. The soil was not dead in the organic sense, Fish said, but it was structurally compromised in a way that would prevent water from moving through it at a useful rate. Standard rehabilitation time, assuming immediate treatment, would be 3 to 5 years. Without treatment, it would hold water on the surface and crack in dry spells and grow nothing useful for longer than that. There was no legal avenue that made sense at the time and cost Marta could absorb. The lease had allowed Hinch to manage drainage. He had managed it. That was the end of that. Sal told her to sell the damaged parcel at whatever it would bring and move on. Marta did not move on. She moved into the farmhouse. She had found something in a wooden box in the back of her father's closet, a small ledger in her grandfather's handwriting. Not a farm log exactly. More like a running set of notes he had kept from a county extension program in the 1950s. Most of it was routine. Seeding dates and rainfall records, and the price he got for processing tomatoes in certain years. But there were 4 pages near the middle that described a problem on a neighboring property, a different property. Nothing to do with the Del Vecchio ground, where runoff from a neighboring dairy had laid down a salt crust on a corner of a field. Her grandfather had written down what the extension agent told the neighbor to do. He had noted the material, the rate, and the outcome in his careful, slanted hand. He had written at the bottom of the 4th page, in English rather than the Italian he used elsewhere, "It does what they say." Marta read those 4 pages 11 times before she ordered her first pallet of agricultural gypsum. What her grandfather had recorded, and what modern soil science has confirmed repeatedly since, is this. Sodium ions are the problem in salt-damaged soil. They attach to the negatively charged surfaces of clay particles and displace calcium, which is what clay particles need to maintain their structure and aggregate together into the loose, crumbly, porous matrix that lets water and roots move through soil. When sodium dominates, the clay particles repel each other, collapse flat, and seal. Water cannot move downward through the profile. Roots cannot penetrate. The surface seals in wet conditions and cracks in dry ones, and nothing useful grows, because even when there is moisture, the plants cannot access it through the compacted, sodium-locked matrix surrounding their roots. Gypsum is calcium sulfate. When it dissolves in soil water, it releases calcium ions in abundance. Those calcium ions compete directly with the sodium ions at the surface of each clay particle, and because calcium carries twice the positive charge, it wins that competition at the clay surface. It displaces the sodium. The sodium, now freed into solution, moves down through the soil profile with irrigation water, dispersing into lower horizons where concentrations are lower and less damaging, or leaving the field entirely through subsurface drainage. The clay particles, now calcium-dominated again, relearn how to aggregate into the loose open structure that makes agricultural soil productive. Pores open. Air returns. Water moves through the soil profile as it is supposed to. The rate matters as much as the material. Too little gypsum and the displacement is insufficient. A partial treatment that improves surface appearance without correcting the deeper structural problem. Too much, and you are wasting inputs and risking sulfate buildup in the subsoil. Marta read the rates her grandfather had recorded, then drove to the county library and found a university extension bulletin from the 1980s that gave application figures calculated against sodium absorption ratio and soil depth. She did the arithmetic herself, twice, using a pencil in the back of a grocery receipt, cross-checking the old ledger rate against the bulletin formula. They matched almost exactly. She applied 4 tons to the acre on a dry October day, working it in with a rented disc, and then she set up her father's old irrigation line and ran water through the field for 3 days straight, giving the gypsum time to dissolve and the displaced sodium time to begin moving. Then she waited. The first sign that something was happening came in late February, 7 months after the first application. The surface of the field, which had been pale gray and hard enough to ring when you hit it with a shovel, turned darker after a rain. Not just surface wet darker. It held the color the way healthy soil holds moisture. Fish came back out without being asked and pushed a probe in and looked at Marta without saying anything for a moment. Then she said the electrical conductivity was down nearly a third from the baseline reading. That was a meaningful number. Electrical conductivity measures the concentration of dissolved salts in soil water, and a 30% drop after a single treatment cycle on ground that had been as compromised as this was not a number Fish had expected to report. Marta planted a test strip of processing tomatoes in April. A small section, maybe a quarter acre, along the north edge, where Fish readings had been best. The transplants went in without the resistance that sodium-compacted soil gives to a transplanter. They did not flag in the first 2 weeks the way stress transplants do when sodium locks soil moisture away from roots. They grew slowly, not magnificently, but they grew without the wilting and yellowing and burned leaf margins that sodium-stressed plants display even when water is technically present in the soil. The tomatoes came off in August at a yield that would not have impressed anyone, but they came off. Sal drove out to see. He walked the rows and said nothing for a long time, and then he said he was glad she had not sold it. Marta applied another round of gypsum in September, a lighter rate this time, 2 tons to the acre, and irrigated again. She did not tell anyone she was expecting the results she was expecting. She had no reason to announce anything. The following spring, she planted the full 12 acres. That was when the problem returned. Not from the soil chemistry, from the season itself. May brought 6 weeks of below-average rainfall followed by a heat event in late June that spiked soil temperatures in the upper layer and pulled moisture out of the root zone faster than the irrigation schedule she had built could compensate. The tomato plants on 8 of the 12 acres went into heat and moisture stress in the first week of July. In sodium-affected soil, even partially rehabilitated, the clay structure is still fragile enough that heat stress causes the surface to reseal under pressure, and once it reseals, the irrigation water cannot penetrate at the rate the crop needs it. The plants on those 8 acres did not recover. Fruit set failed. She would have been better off planting a cover crop and carrying no market commitment. She sat on the farmhouse porch for 2 evenings without doing much of anything. She went through the treatment records and the soil data she had kept and looked at where the 4 acres that performed were located on the field map. Low ground, more flush from adjacent drainage, more total water movement through the profile over the 2 treatment years. The 8 that failed sat higher and had received less total leaching. They were not ready, and she had not known they were not ready. She had solved the right problem on the wrong assumption. The ground was not uniformly rehabilitated. She had treated it as if it were, and it had told her plainly that it was not. She booked a second formal consultation with Fish. Fish pulled the comparison data and told Marta what Marta had already worked out herself, that the west side of the field, where hench drainage had pooled most heavily, needed a 3rd treatment cycle before it would behave like the east. 2 more years, Fish said. Maybe less if the rainfall cooperated and gave the leaching process natural help. Marta did not plant the full field the following year. She rested the compromised 8 acres under a winter rye cover crop, which added organic matter and kept the surface from resealing, and ran tomatoes only on the 4 proven acres. She did not lose money that year. In the spring of the year after that, she planted all 12 acres again. The buyer who came out in August was not there because of anything Marta had advertised. A produce broker named Tellerman, who had been sourcing from her small 4-acre contract, reached out to ask if she had additional volume available for the following season. She said she might. He came to look at the field and spent 40 minutes walking it slowly, and said nothing except to ask what variety she was running and what her irrigation source was. He came back with a contract offer in September. The contract price per ton was 11% above what she had been receiving on the small contract. The volume commitment was for the full 12 acres the following season. Tellerman wrote a number on a single sheet of paper and pushed it across the kitchen table, and Marta looked at it for a moment and said she would let him know by Friday. She called Sal that night. He asked what the number was. She told him. He did not say anything for a moment, and then he said he should have moved into the farmhouse. Grover Hinch was still farming ground south of the county. Nobody contacted him. Nobody needed to. He had made his calculation when he set up that drainage tile, and she had made hers when she opened the ledger, and the soil had made its own reckoning over 3 treatment cycles, one displaced ion at a time, and the ledger came out where it came out. The county extension office ran a workshop on sodium-affected soils the following winter. Real attendance numbers. Farmers who had been watching what happened on the Delvecchio ground without wanting to say they had been watching, who wanted the mechanism explained without anyone having to own that they had observed something they had been told was not worth observing. Fish ran the workshop. Marta sat in the back row and did not present anything and did not need to. Hinch did not attend. Now look out across 12 acres in Yolo County on a July morning. The soil is dark from irrigation the night before. The tomato plants run to the field edge in straight rows, leaves broad and unmarked, fruit set dense along the lower trusses. The surface moves water the way it was built to move water. The clay particles, reset by calcium to the structure they carried before a tenant with a drainage tile and a departure date had his way with them, hold their aggregates. Nothing about the field announces what it went through. It does not need to announce anything. The ground knows. Leave a comment below and tell where you are watching from, and whether you have ever seen land that someone said was finished, brought back by someone willing to wait. If this kind of story is what you came here for, subscribe so you do not miss the next one.